Welcome to today's webinar, Securing ePHI with Effective Database Activity Monitoring, brought to you today by HIMSS and NitroSecurity. My name is Suzanne, and I will serve as your moderator today. Before we get started, I'd like to give everyone a few little bits of housekeeping in case you have any issues today. All attendees are in listen-only mode, so no need to worry about muting your line. We will also be having a Q&A session at the end of this session, so please make sure to submit all of your questions in the Q&A panel directed to all panelists on the right side of your screen. Any questions that are submitted in the chat area will be reminded to use the Q&A area, as they often can be lost if submitted there. For technical assistance during today's presentation, feel free to send me a chat by directing it to Suzanne or host, and I will be more than happy to help you. If you are having audio issues, please feel sure to click on the Info tab, and that will give you a dial-in number along with an access code and attendee ID to help you for today's presentation. Now I would like to go ahead and remind everyone that an archive will be available of this presentation along with the slides. If you check in your chat area, you will also see that there is a link for you to download the PDF of the presentation if you would like to follow along. Now it's on to introduce today's presenters. We have Mac McMillan, who is co-founder and CEO of Synergest Tech Incorporated, a firm specializing in the areas of information security and regulatory compliance in the healthcare sector. We also have Mel Shakir, serves the office of the CTO at NitroSecurity, where he brings over 15 years of experience in software development and management, information security, and database technologies. Mac is going to get us started today, so I'm going to go ahead and pass on to Mac.
Thank you very much, and welcome everybody to our presentation today. You should see here the agenda slide in front of you, and I'm going to provide just a brief introduction, and then Mel, who is our primary presenter today, is going to really take you through an in-depth look at database monitoring and auditing and the technology that supports that. Before I do that, though, we're going to have a very quick introduction to the organizations that both of us are from, and then we'll get started. So I'm with Synergest Tech. We have been working in healthcare for the 8 years that we've been in existence, since 2003. We have clients across the country, but more importantly, we work with a lot of other companies like NitroSecurity to actually help them integrate healthcare knowledge, healthcare expertise as it relates to information security into those systems so that they better support the community out there. And of course, we also work with a lot of folks like HIMSS. I chair the Privacy and Security Committee at the moment, and we're very involved, obviously, in a lot of the comments that we're putting together now for a lot of the things like the ONC strategic plan, if you will, and meaningful use stage 2 and 3, and there's lots of lively discussion around those topics and what needs to be said with respect to privacy and security. So that's a little bit about us. I'd like to turn it over now to Mel to talk a little bit about Nitro before we get started.
Okay, thank you, Mac. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us on the webcast. Again, I'm Mel Shakir, and I'm the Chief Technology Officer at NitroSecurity. I've spent the last 15 years in information technology, and a good portion of that was focused on database security. I'm also the chief architect of the product, NitroView Database Monitor, which we often call as NitroView DBM. Just a little bit of brief information about us. We are headquartered out of Portsmouth, New Hampshire. We have over 500 enterprise and government customers today. We have been growing very, very rapidly. And what really sets us apart from the competition is the fact that we have not only taken the SIM requirements, which is the security information and event management, but very tightly integrated log management and other key technologies like database activity monitoring, intrusion protection systems, application monitoring, all in a single suite, which makes the solution very, very effective. We have also taken our product through a number of very critical certifications, like the defense certifications and for critical infrastructure. So we are EAL3 certified. We are also FIPS Level 2 certified, which provides assurance for our customers that the solutions we provide have gone through stringent tests. We are also currently the #1 vendor on InfoWorld in terms of logging, and SC Magazine has honored us by putting us in the Hall of Fame. This is just a small list of some of our healthcare customers: HHS, FDA, some of the bigger customers, Catholic Health West, and there are so many others which range from all small, medium, and large customers as well. With that, I want to actually pass the ball back to Mac, so he can talk a little bit about the challenges and give you some primer on database security. Mac, all yours.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Mel, for that introduction. So let's talk a little bit about this topic. And I think, first of all, let's start off with talking about why it's important that we do this. As you all know, both HIPAA and HITECH require us to audit access to patient information. So active monitoring is something today that is not only required, but it's actually necessary given the level of data and the complexity of a lot of our environments. And in fact, when you look at active monitoring and you look at the reasons for why we need to think about using a tool like a SIM, if you will, to do this for this purpose, you know, really that threat environment that's out there today really causes some real consequences, and it's a very complex environment. If you look at just the threats that have come out in the last 2 years, the total number has elapsed all the threats that we've seen in the last 30 years prior to that. It's amazing how many types of attacks that are out there today. And a lot of them are much more organized today because our data is much more valuable to people, whether it's financial data in terms of a credit card or a social security number, or whether it's a medical identity information that somebody could use for some purpose that is unintended. So information has more value, and because of that, the threat out there is very real. Our environments, as all of us know, are very complex as well. We have hundreds of applications in many of our hospital settings, and all of those applications tend to have some back-end database that's associated with them. But even if we just take those databases, or those structured databases, if you will, that are associated with those applications, we also have a number of databases that get created independently within our environment. And I recall a couple of assessments that we've performed at healthcare settings where we found as many as 1,500 to 2,000 databases, many of which are access databases, but databases that were created for one purpose or another. And many of these standalone databases that get created for these discrete purposes, a lot of times people forget about them and they end up sitting out there, and a lot of times they're developed without a lot of thought given to where they're living or existing in the environment and who has access to them. And then last but not least, the regulatory picture is certainly stepping up for all of us. We have more and more rules that are coming out. This year alone, we should see the final breach notification rule come out. We should see the NPRM with respect to accounting for disclosures come out, and that will be very important to this discussion today. So there's really a lot of accountability that's being injected into our environment, and you see that quote down there from Ms. Alston, who is a new deputy director at OCR for enforcement, and she is the lady that's spearheading the activity around training the state attorney generals, and who potentially will get into the act more actively later this year after they've all had their training. So let's talk about some of the issues related to database security that we need to be concerned with. And the first one I alluded to in my comments a moment ago, which is just discovering where all these databases are and how many databases we have out there. The second piece of this is actually conducting vulnerability assessment against those databases or against the environments that those databases reside in to make sure that they're in fact protected and secure. There's access authorization. Who actually has access to these databases? How can they gain access to these databases? Can we ensure that they only gain access to these databases, for instance, through appropriate applications, or can they get direct access to these databases? Have we taken into consideration the requirements for data that's moving from these databases to other locations or outside of the environment? have we taken into consideration how we're securing this information in these databases themselves? In other words, are we encrypting them? Do we have safe harbor? Is that something that's even possible or desired? And are we really monitoring what's going on with respect to these databases? Do we know when somebody accesses the database directly, such as a DBA, as opposed to going through the application as we should be? And last but not least, do we know that information is not potentially leaking out of the organization, either by someone copying information from one of these databases and attaching it to some document, say a webmail, for instance, or through some other mechanism where this data may potentially leave the organization that's not in an authorized fashion. Looking at some of the challenges we have in terms of managing these things, we obviously have technical challenges that are associated with this. I've talked about already the data is constantly in motion. I think everybody who works in healthcare today recognizes that in the average healthcare setting where we have thousands of users, I think I saw a chart not too long ago that was put together by a physician that must have had over 150 different organizations or individuals or offices, if you will, that touch patient information in a typical care setting. When you just look at the number of people that are accessing this information, that have to touch this information in some fashion or another, immediately you understand how complex it is in terms of accounting for those disclosures and access. There's enormous volumes of database activity that ends up having to be logged. In most settings today, we can't afford to have performance impacts, which is one of the things that's very important to us. Segregation of security duties for DBAs. If, for instance, we don't think about this so much in HIPAA because HIPAA doesn't really speak to this issue, but if we have PCI requirements, it absolutely speaks to this issue. And do we have segregation between DBAs? Do we have segregation between the folks managing the system and the DBA and the folks that are monitoring and making sure that folks are accessing the database appropriately? Changes to applications, are they being done in an acceptable manner? Are they actually being done through the application as opposed to the database directly? Who has access to this database? What agents are out there that impact where these databases reside and how that impacts the environment? And of course, the connection pools that can potentially hide a user's identity or generic access, for instance, that we see in a lot of cases used by admins and sometimes by DBAs to do activity or to do the work that they do in these systems, which can obviously mask who the person is that's actually doing the work. Who's going to be responsible for monitoring this? Does the average hospital have a security operations center? In most cases, the answer is no. Do they have a network operations center? In some cases, yes, and that might be an acceptable place. Is the DBA going to be responsible in some manner for monitoring? Or is there an application team? Actually, is there a security organization that's going to be doing this kind of activity? And last but not least, obviously there's budgeting issues with this activity, and it doesn't just include the technology that has to be involved to get it done, but it also is the people that have to be involved, and more importantly, the back-end processes that have to be established to handle the information that is gleaned from doing monitoring. When you look at, typically look at database monitoring and how it fits in the overall kind of progression of implementing security technologies, typically we see folks addressing things like vulnerability assessments and antivirus, firewalls, IDS, access control, etc. initially. And then we'll see sometimes the deployment of SIMs or log managers, if you will, to begin to collect logs in an automated fashion to be able to review them. And then typically, sometime after that, people begin to understand that that just simply looking at the logs that our network devices or our servers or our applications provide is not enough. That if we have databases out there, you can actually access those databases directly and bypass those application controls, and therefore it's important to actually monitor those databases themselves. And last but not least, we begin to see things like data loss prevention technologies implemented that hopefully catch information that we don't want leaving the organization in an improper fashion. I'll tell you a little story about the young man in this picture after I'm done here. But obviously, some of the threats that we have out there that we're all concerned about are excessive privilege abuse. Again, that person who has legitimate access to the information and has either an admin type access or DBA access that can allow them to make changes in a database that could potentially go undetected. Legitimate privilege escalation, database platform vulnerabilities, obviously things like SQL injection, weak audit trails are always an issue. Certainly we're concerned about denial of service as it relates to critical databases out there. Obviously when our clinicians access an application, they absolutely have to have the data available to them when they need it to do whatever it is they need to do. All of these things can create issues for us, and all of these things can be actually monitored against. That good-looking young man in that picture actually happens to be Mel's son, which I'm sure he's very proud of. So last but not least, and I think it can be safely said that there's a need for real due diligence, if you will, and awareness of what's going on in our environment. OCR is doing a great job at their responsibilities for enforcement of the HIPAA security rule. They're working very diligently on the various rules that they need to develop and produce under HITECH. They've always had a philosophy that's aimed at promoting compliance as opposed to punishment. But recently, as we've all seen, there have been fines that have been issued. And those fines were not on investigations that were started this year, but they were investigations that were started back in 2010 time frame that finally came to fruition at the beginning of this year, and we actually saw the outcome of that. When you look at the number of incidents that occurred in 2010, it's pretty startling. There were over 240 major breaches in 2010. Those are breaches that involved more than 500 individual records. There were approximately 25,000 smaller breaches that were reported to OCR as well. And of course, there were countless others that were either not reported because they didn't meet a harm threshold, or were not reported, unfortunately, because they weren't even detected. And that's really where this monitoring comes in, because it's those ones that we don't even detect that probably worry us the most. Either way, it's obvious that we can do a better job of protecting data and managing access to it. Certainly we want to see these numbers go down in the future. I talked about the fines, and I'll talk about those very briefly. Obviously, the Signet Health situation is not one, if you're familiar with the specifics of that case, quite frankly, that should concern anybody, because I'm sure no one on this call is going to choose to not cooperate with the government when they come to investigate. Unfortunately, they did, and they suffered a much more severe penalty as a result. Massachusetts General Hospital basically had an issue of a loss of common sense, where an individual took information home and left it in a public area, and it was later recovered by someone else. They did cooperate. They were fined for the breach. They were also given a resolution agreement to address the shortcoming and to remediate the situation. We've got 2 people at least sentenced to jail time now, one last year and one that was just announced here recently. And there are several others that are under indictment now. And I think what you're going to see as 2011 continues to unfold, because most of these investigations take some time to come to fruition, especially those that are going to result in either a fine or some criminal prosecution. I think you're going to begin to see more and more of this as time goes on, and as these investigations finally come to a head, if you will. And last but not least, as I talked about, the OCR did start its process for educating the state attorney generals around the country so that they too can be prepared to fulfill their responsibilities in enforcing HIPAA security. And so it's anybody's guess as to how active they will be, but certainly they will now have the information that they need in order to be able to do that more effectively. So the bottom line is we have a situation where we have a very active threat environment. We have a lot of very valuable information, and we have a lot of people who have access to it or need to have access to it. We have folks out there who have the ability to access this data directly and with elevated privileges. And we have an enforcement or regulatory environment that says we have rules that we need to follow, and we're going to ensure that organizations are doing that. So we want to reduce that risk, and one of the ways that we can do that as it relates to our databases is to actually actively monitor those systems. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Mel again.
Thank you, Mac. And one of the things I'd like to reemphasize that Mac already talked about is the fact that a database server is a critical piece of computing infrastructure. They not only store the sensitive data, but they are the engine behind your critical applications, whether it is an EMR application, whether it's a backend to your website, or it is a billing application. And from Mac's presentation, we can also appreciate the fact that it is not so easy to secure a database as it is to secure some other network devices or servers, simply because there are many facets involved. First of all, the data is constantly in motion. So you have to worry about and have a program in place for data discovery. You also need to worry about vulnerability assessment so that you understand what the risks are and where the systems have not been patched, etc. You also have to worry about access control and authorization controls. You have to worry about encryption in motion and at rest. You have to worry about monitoring. That is an essential control. And then finally, you have to worry about leakage. So there are various facets to it. And my objective today is to present you with our experience and the industry trends. So hopefully, those can help you make good choices when it comes to technology selection, especially, and also ensuring that the database security fits nicely into your overall security program within the organization. Okay, so you get the benefits beyond compliance to actually protect your critical data. So in today's presentation, I'm going to cover database security as as the top use cases. Why do people buy database security monitoring solutions? How do they integrate it into the environment? And the first and foremost, the most important use case of all is the privileged user monitoring. So most regulations, including PCI and HIPAA, either explicitly or implicitly, have a requirement that you need to audit and monitor privileged user activity. And in the case of databases, who is that privileged user? It's the DBA. Okay. The second important use case is database protection. This is to ensure that the integrity of your database servers is preserved from both external and internal threats. Now, from an external threat perspective, SQL injection is one of the biggest threats to the web application and database servers that we need to be aware about. The third item, detecting fraud and policy violations. So once you have monitoring in place, then the whole idea is that is the utilization of the database and the critical data in it within bounds, or is someone not following the security policy? Simple things like shared accounts, weak passwords, improper configuration, all of that stuff has to be followed closely. The next use case that people implement database security for is to get an understanding of who the top consumers of sensitive data really are. where is the sensitive data, who uses it, what do they need it for, and how do they utilize it. Not knowing where the sensitive data is and who uses it does not typically go well when you have an audit. And finally, the last use case is getting more and more important with HIPAA and some of the privacy reporting requirements in HITECH. So it does not have to be a scramble every time there is an audit. If someone needs a report or you need to conduct a breach or a privacy investigation, the whole procedure needs to be well understood, and it should become a routine without which lots of time and effort and potentially a lot of money is spent wastefully. So again, these are the top use cases for database security. I'm going to go through each one of them just to give you a brief sense of how the monitoring is done. In this case, the first example, how do you monitor user privileged activity? So in this simple example, user JSmith is accessing the core database server for for normal use. The normal activity is being logged in the form of an audit trail. Typically, you will have to record every single thing that a privileged user does. And what I mean by that is everything from the login to the log off. Every single activity of a privileged user must get logged. And that is what is the explicit or implicit requirement in the regulations. And this activity needs to be collected and correlated and analyzed so that it can be reported upon. Okay. Now, the second use case, around database protection can be well understood by just thinking about a simple brute force attack. A simple brute force attack wherein someone tries to gain access to the database, and what is the typical behavior? It's going to result in a few failed logins, and then there's going to be a successful login when the person has successfully understood the password or got the password. Okay. Now, this is one of the things that you would expect from the database monitoring products, that you're not only logging the events, but you're trying to get some intelligence around it, wherein you see a pattern of failed logins and a successful login, and you could report back as a highly critical event saying that there was a successful database brute force. Okay. And of course, it's crucial when it's on the important servers. As a third example about SQL injection, I'm going to make it look simplistic, and the reason for that is because it is simplistic. There are many tools out there that can help exploit the vulnerabilities in your applications. Okay. Simple tools like SQL Map, for example. They can very easily spider your web application. And in this example, it's looking for SQL injection flaws. And when it finds one, it injects a simple code in the database. Then it's a game of just waiting. Waiting for a user to come in and access legitimate data, which has now been altered and is going to result in execution of code, perhaps within a browser. Okay. Now, that browser has been compromised, and the first desktop has been compromised. This is the beginning of the compromising other assets. So SQL injection has to be taken extremely seriously, and one of the best ways to monitor SQL injection attacks is by having a good database monitoring product. I'm going to explain that a little bit later. How not just the web application monitoring, but also the database monitoring is extremely crucial to detect these attacks before they succeed. The next one, of course, when we said that the access of the database has to be within bounds. If there's anomalous activity, you should know about it, and simple things we could do. Now, in this case, the user JSmith is accessing a critical database, and when he accesses unusual amount of data, and especially if the response of the data is credit card numbers, social security numbers, patient names, and things of that nature, and it is not the normal kind of rows being returned back, you could easily alert on that. A good database monitoring product will do that right out of the box. Another reason, again, is the Verizon data breach report. I would highly recommend that folks who have not seen these reports look at them. The one this references the 2009, but a 2011 just came out. So every year, Verizon has been very meticulously documenting all the database breaches, not only the database breaches, but any breaches that are occurring. And 79% of the attack paths are through compromised web applications. Okay? 75% of all the records that are actually compromised are database server records. And it's understandable why, because databases are for storing data. That's where all your critical data usually is. And the most compromised type of data has been payment card data in 2009, but the trend is changing, and there's more and more patient information coming online. So we're going to expect more and more, personal kind of information outside of credit card information in the news as well. And the types of assets being misused within an organization, well, 23% of the times they are database servers, because again, that is where all the sensitive data resides. Now, my objective today also is to tell you, what works in database monitoring, where you're going to run into trouble if you try to implement different kinds of tools and technologies or different kind of architectures. So in this case, I have a very high-level picture where it shows that there is a database agent that is installed on the database server. It's to the extreme right. And you could certainly deploy a database agent on every database server. Okay? The next kind of model is that you put a network appliance. Now, instead of an agent on every database server, you could have a network appliance which monitors all the traffic that goes back and forth from the users and the applications back to the database server. Now, you are essentially eavesdropping on that information, but by eavesdropping, you're collecting a comprehensive audit trail. And in the third architecture, usually it is a network-based product and maybe a few agents on some critical servers. Now, based on our experience, what works and what starts to become a higher cost of ownership down the line. And typically, the higher cost of ownership happens when you make a technology selection to go with point agents. And when I say point agents, in this case, for example, if the agent is only a database activity monitoring agent and it doesn't do anything else, then you have one more agent to deploy on every server. Now, not only do agents have some performance impact, which means that if the amount of activity it's monitoring increases, well, what is the agent going to do? It's going to consume more CPU and more resources from those boxes. So that usually becomes a concern for some organizations, especially on busy servers. Okay. Then you have to also worry about the management. They have to be deployed and they have to be managed. And every time the vendor comes back with a new version, you got to redeploy it. Every time the vendor comes up with a bug fix, you got to redeploy it. So in an environment, in a larger environment, they start to become a little bit of a headache. Also, they have limited scalability because when you have an agent, then you essentially have, if you have lots of database servers, you have all these agents pushing back data to one location, okay? One or more locations. And typically, the logs that have been produced, through native auditing. A lot of agents do utilize native auditing, and what I mean by native auditing is the features and functions that are provided by the database vendor themselves to collect the audit data. In many cases, those logs are inferior in quality. So the network-based appliance approach, in our opinion, seems to work out much better. Again, we as a vendor provide both approaches, but definitely want to make a recommendation based on our experience. Now, we have customers who also prefer to build their own homegrown scripts, and again, from the perspective of cost savings, that's what they think, that they're going to save money by implementing some homegrown stuff and going to utilize the features that are already present in the database server for auditing. But over and beyond the 4 pitfalls that I just talked about, performance impact, harder to deploy and manage, inferior logs, there are many other pitfalls that you need to know about. Okay? Number 1, from a compliance perspective, it is absolutely critical that the security monitoring function is segregated from the DBA, right? And Mac talked about this also. The DBA cannot be monitoring themselves. It has to be somebody else, and that typically somebody else is the information security team or the security operations center. Okay, so if you're going to use any native controls, how are you going to give the security teams access to all your databases? This becomes a problem. Also, the DBA being the god of the database servers, he has all the controls to turn things on and off. So you have to find a slightly different way. And a network-based approach completely segregates that function from the DBA because he has no access, no control over that network appliance. Okay, so that is why that is another preferred method. The other important thing is that if you try to grow homegrown scripts, it becomes a nightmare when you try to do any kind of reporting or if you want to build any intelligence on top of those events. A simple example I gave you of a brute force. That is a very simple example where there were failed logins and then a successful login. Well, if you're going to try to do it on your own, you will have to write custom code for many different kinds of variations. Okay, and when it comes to SQL injection monitoring and others, it starts to get a little complicated. Most of the native tools, they usually provide just auditing functions. They're not really security tools. Okay, so they are not monitoring the response. So when I give you some examples of anomalous activity, people accessing stuff outside their normal bounds, they're accessing social security numbers, credit card numbers, patient healthcare records, which is not normal. These tools cannot give you, the native tools don't have any insight into that at all because all they do is they log the query. They do not log the response. Okay? So that is something that you definitely need to know and remember. It becomes important when you report on these things that you mask sensitive data. So if there are sensitive data, it cannot show up in your report because then essentially you're walking around with these documents containing sensitive data, yet another place where the data from the database has migrated over to. Okay. Plus, in a short while, I'm going to show you talk about the integration within the larger security framework. You don't want to probably do database monitoring as a standalone solution. It does not give you the benefits that it gives you when you are fully integrated into the rest of your security framework. And we're going to look at that in a little more detail. Okay. So here's Gartner's report. And I just wanted to put this chart up because it says that, well, if you need good monitoring, you need a SIM. And what is a SIM? A security information event management product, which brings in information from your routers, firewalls, switches, IPSs, IDSs, endpoint security agents, like virus detection and others. And then you also need a DAM. And what is a DAM? A DAM is a database activity monitoring product. But by the way, you also need a DLP because when the data leaks out, the SIM or the DAM may not be good enough. But also, you might also need a fraud detection solution because the kind of analytics that is needed is simply not present in the other three category of products. And that becomes an issue for a lot of folks because now, where do you invest your dollars? Each one of these technologies seems to be good at just one of the things, but you need it all. And that is one of the key problems that we try to solve is that you need an integrated solution and you have to do all the pieces. You can't do one and ignore the other. So here, I want to explain to you what this architecture looks like. Integrated database security with the rest of security. So let's say, you have the hybrid approach where you take the network appliance for scalability and you have a few agents deployed on the boxes. Now, if you have your security policies done correctly, you will not need a single agent. That means you can just live with a few network appliances. Now, how do you do that? The agent is only needed because in a lot of instances, we find that the DBAs have the privileges to get on the server and run SQL commands locally. Now, if you do something locally, physically on the box, that activity does not show up on the network. So your network appliance cannot monitor that stuff, and that is the reason to deploy agents. But many of our customers, they have put in place really good security policies. They told, as part of the security policy, they ensured that the DBAs run all the SQL commands from their own desktop so that they can be monitored. And when there's a security violation, they just look for the exceptions to that policy by monitoring the OS events. Did somebody actually log on and run something locally? And that is a fantastic way to do it. Good security policies and good tools, and you have the best outcome. because without good security policies, even the best tools are not going to protect your infrastructure the way you'd want them to. The next thing is from external attacks. If you already have IPS in line, to block things like SQL injection or other exploits, database exploits. Typically, for that you need something that is in line. Okay. You also don't want to ignore monitoring the database server host. We see this all the time that folks are monitoring the SQL activity because they have critical data in them, but they are not monitoring who's logging on and off the host. They're not checking, is the DBA backing up the database to the disk and FTPing it out? Is somebody changing the configuration files of the database server? All that stuff is completely forgotten, and lots of backdoors are left open. So you cannot ignore monitoring the activity, the security events on the host, database server host itself. Now, from a leakage prevention perspective, you could put controls around the users. So when the data from the database actually moves to the desktop, okay, either they're using applications and it ends up on the desktop, or they use Excel or MS Access or any other thing, the data essentially makes its way from the database back to the desktop. And if you're worried about leakage, then you put controls around it, and the controls would essentially look for, emails, what's going on in the email, what's going on in the webmail, what's being posted on internet, instant messaging sessions and things of that nature. Is there any P2P file transfer to transfer the files? Those controls can be added on later on when you see fit. But they can be part of your, your Lego set where you build up security. And finally, all this information has to come back into a central platform, because if you want to correlate events, and the simple example I gave earlier was, if somebody backs up the database to a disk and then he FTPs it out, okay, you're going to get alerts from two different systems. The first one comes from a database server saying that, hey, the backup actually it usually goes to tape, but this time it went to disk. You have to have a good rule to do that. And the second alert came from the operating system where you're monitoring the host server. It's saying there was an FTP transfer, and here's the file that got transferred. Okay. So you have to be able to correlate these events. If you're just monitoring a single thing, if you're just monitoring SQL activity in a silo, you won't be able to correlate it. Now, when all this information comes to the top, you also, you are enriching that information you're collecting with VA scan results. So, for example, when you ran your VA scanner against all the database servers, it reported back that, hey, these servers are not patched. These servers have critical data in them. Once you have this intelligence from a VA scan, these tools, and our tool included, utilize that information to increase the severity when it matters. When the attack is going to be successful because they're exploiting a known vulnerability on that server, then we would raise the importance of that alert. Because in your day-to-day environment, there'll be so many alerts, so many events occurring, millions of them literally, even in a small environment, that the important ones will get lost if they are not, properly, if their severities are not properly raised. And you cannot do that without tools. Then again, you need notification, you need reporting for compliance purposes, and all that. All of that happens to the central unit. And this is how, the database security plays into the rest of the security portfolio. Okay. Now I want to do a very quick product demonstration. I'm going to go through this real fast, but it's going to be in the form of screenshots. Okay. You don't have time for a live. So privileged user monitoring, what is it that it looks like in the database world? So here's a screenshot which shows you that on the left-hand side, these are the database servers that are being monitored. And on the right-hand side, these are the events that are being generated. Now, you're also seeing blues and reds. Okay, now blues and reds are essentially, the blues are more normal activity. The reds are saying that I haven't seen this before, or there's something critical about it that you need to analyze. Okay, and the very first alert says that I'm capturing the audit trail of a DBA. Okay, so a DBA had logged on, and we need to capture every single thing that person did. Now, in this screenshot, earlier I explained to you that there's an implicit or explicit requirement in all the compliance regulation that you capture the entire audit trail of the DBA. And that really means from log on to log off. So in this screen, we are just showing you that somebody logged in as user SA, and then every single command that he did. So in the first one, he tried to add a login, and then he tried to add a user. And in both the instances, his commands actually failed. So it was important to track not only the commands that he was executing, but also the response, the outcome of those commands. That did they succeed? Did they fail? And that is critical when you're monitoring SQL injection attacks as well. Okay. Now here's another example. When the auditors walk in the door, they usually ask for a report where they say, well, if you have the controls in place, show me what changes were made by DBAs in production environments in the last month or last week, which really means that which tables were created, which views were created, and things of that nature. And it is, you can have a very nice graphical report, which is just one click away. Or maybe you're already scheduling these reports and posting on a server for the auditors to access. So all this stuff is getting automated. The next part about database protection, and again, I'm going to talk a little bit about SQL injection attacks. Here in this screenshot, everything is a little bit tiny. It's hard to read. But if you look somewhere in the middle, you'll see SQL injection attack, failures of low severity. And the one that is highlighted, it says successful logon after repeated failed login attempts. So what I'm showing you here is actually a dashboard, which is showing you correlated events, not just single events, but a pattern. Something, lots of events together, resulting in showing you something important that's going on. So one was the brute force. The second one, the SQL injection. The reason we recognize that really well, without any false positive, on the database server is because before the SQL injection succeeds, it usually has a lot of failed queries, because the person who's trying to break in, he's trying to figure out, what is the schema, what are the table names, and he has a lot of syntax errors and failures before he succeeds, and that is enough to be able to capture that activity on the database side without any false positive, because that is the pattern that we're looking for, and that is the pattern that is typical of a SQL injection. The next screenshot, it says, it just shows you, how the rules are written. That, when there's a failed login, it's one thing. But if there's a failed login using a high privileged account, like a system administrator, then that is a more critical alert than just a failed login. Because if somebody does log in as a successful super user, the implications are different. And in this rule, what it's essentially saying is that it's looking for the response message, which the message number, which may be 18450 or any one of the other numbers for SQL Server. You have similar messages coming back from Oracle or Sybase or DB2. And then you associate it with the username. Is this a SA? Is this a administrator? And then you raise the severity of the alert. The next one, use case on detecting fraud and policy violations is, how do you do that? Well, you look inside the response content. Okay, so what is the response of the query? And in this case, this simple example, if you look at the bottom, it says response content, and there's a regular expression. That regular expression is actually looking for credit card numbers. Okay, that's PCI data. It could be healthcare data, patient information, patient names. And the AND clause right after that is showing you AND not the application name equal to ORA RPT. What this simple rule that you can build is telling you that if anybody accesses ORA RPT, anybody accesses database outside of this reporting application called ORA RPT, that is an unauthorized application. You see how a simple rule like this could really enhance your database security posture, because now you can identify any application outside of a normal application. Essentially, a whitelisted it. I'm going to skip through this one. When we talked a little bit about investigations, what it's really going to come down to is the fact that do you have all the data you need to report back during an investigation? Most people don't have that. And you need to be able to log at very granular levels to be able to capture the details, log in to log off, every single thing. And a lot of people come back and ask me, how can you do that for every database server and every session in the entire environment? And that is where the secret sauce comes in, is the way we capture the data, the way we distribute the data across the appliances and present it, okay, and how much we retain and where we retain. We can certainly go through those details, if any of you are interested. Here's a simple rule again, which shows you, how we build the rule which says unauthorized application. Again, simply we were looking for somebody accessing my server, but the application was not my application. Very simple rule. Okay. Here's an example of profiling activity. So, you have lots of users accessing lots of information. You need to be able to see whether this is normal or not normal. In this case, we clicked on user sys and seeing, what are the kinds of commands he's running. So you don't want to look at the entire query, but you want to know whether he created a table or he dropped the table. What was the table name? So on the top right, you see the table called DB or Trojan, and which instance. You see ORCL, and you're seeing it in blues and reds. So if he does it for the first time, he's never done it before, it's not his regular thing, it's immediately going to get highlighted. And you can easily profile users' activity this way. Okay. The next one, who are the top consumers of sensitive data? And we've already seen this example where we are monitoring for all the PCI data being accessed. Okay. Now I want to show you one quick screenshot. This one shows that is focused or customized only to see the information in the payment records database. Okay, and the reason why this view was customized for this application was to involve the subject matter expert, somebody who understands applications really well, or at least his application really well, to participate in the security process. So when somebody, in the security operations center or looks at the events, it may not trigger to them, or it may not occur to them that this is something that they need to look at because they may not have a keen understanding of the application. So you can customize views and for different kinds of roles and different kind of subject matter experts, and give them access to only that limited information, and have them participate in the overall security process to improve your security. Okay, and then the breach reporting. Basically what we provide is lots of different views, lots of different reports, which will help you, report on the standard things auditors ask for, the standard things you would need in an investigation, and then it also comes with a full-fledged framework, so you can build your own reports and tools if the ones that are provided out of box don't exactly match your criteria. Okay, here's another example where we talk about the fact that it's not just about monitoring the SQL, but you also have to monitor the database configs and backup files and other things which are operating system level monitoring. And you have to integrate that with database monitoring. Okay. Another example of database discovery, I'm going to skip that. And this example shows, how if you have a few agents around the environment, because your DBAs are allowed to be in the box and there is local activity, then you can pick it up from agents, and that integration of the agents with the rest of the platform is also very important. That's it. I think I've pretty much covered everything. There are a few more screenshots around, how you can even utilize these tools for operations work and for change control, but I'm going to skip that part. Just one other thing to mention here, probably the last, is application user tracking. So when you have application connecting on your behalf to the database server, it uses a service account. Okay, so you have to you not only want to monitor the DBA access, that is them accessing the database directly, but also the activity that comes in through the application, and the real application user name may not appear in the database logs because the application server connects on behalf of the application user using a service account. So these are questions that you must ask the database vendors when you pick and choose a product. The final screenshot is, how do you mask the data, like we talked about earlier in the reports and other places. The tools should be able to do that for you. Okay. So that's about it. I would like to open it up for questions at this point.
Okay.
Yeah, just have a
All right, thank you, Mel and Mac, for that awesome presentation today. We are getting close to being on top of the hour. However, for those of you who can stay for just a few more minutes, we're going to go ahead and ask a few questions. We will also be sending out some of these questions out to you in a follow-up email with hopefully some answers in there. And let's see, I got a question going on here in the Q&A section. This one would be for Mel. Is there a limit to the number of databases that the Nitro Dam can monitor?
Well, there is no limit per se, but the physical limits, they come from the fact that there's an appliance and there is a certain processing power in that appliance, a certain amount of memory. So yes, from that perspective, when you exceed the capacity of the appliance, you may have to add another appliance. But you can add as many appliances as you need or as you grow. The small appliances will typically monitor 5,000 transactions per second, which is a pretty decent amount. And the large ones will monitor 15,000 queries per second. And we are coming up with even larger appliances soon.
All right, thank you. And also for our attendees, just to make note that there is a poll today on the side. If you can just take a few seconds as you're listening to the Q&A today and let us know what you thought of today's webinar. The next question I have is directed to Mac. Does PCI require database monitoring?
Actually, it does. It's very specific. It says that organizations that fall under the PCI data security standard who process credit card information must monitor access to that cardholder data. And it identifies 4 specific areas that they expect to monitor for as it relates to databases. One of those is, as we talked about before, the segregation of duties issue, making sure that there are different folks managing the database as opposed to those who are working in the database. It looks for, you have to monitor for high-risk activities such as privileged users, people who can actually make changes to those databases. You're supposed to audit for how those databases are actually updated, and that's supposed to be through appropriate application access so that gets recorded as opposed to directly to it. And that is the last requirement, which is to monitor any direct access to the database by anyone.
All right, thank you, Matt. We're going to see if we can squeeze in 1 or 2 more questions in here. Okay, and for Mel, we've got another question. What are your suggestions to redeploy vendor applications more effectively or easily in a large environment?
Vendor applications. If you could, well, let me try to answer the best I understand it. When you say by vendor applications, I'm hoping you're talking about our product and how you deploy it best in your environment. Well, like I said before, it's a matter of 2 things. One is tools and policies. So understanding exactly what the tool does and how it operates, their architecture is very critical, because when you deploy it, you want to make sure that you're not leaving back doors. Like I said, if you're deploying a network appliance to monitor your applications, then you want to make sure that the DBAs don't have direct console activity, because you would not, you would leave a hole there. You wouldn't be monitoring that without deploying the agents. Again, the choices that you make is going to affect your bottom line. If you deploy agents, there's going to be definitely more management involved. The appliances are much easier to manage in the long term. Comes down to choices. And again, if your applications are all, if your internal applications are all, all over the place, you probably want to consolidate them on certain networks, because when you start monitoring them over the network, what we typically look for is span ports or mirrored ports. So if they are distributed across your entire environment, across different switches, you may end up purchasing more of our kind of appliances just because you cannot consolidate the activity readily into one server. So these are kind of things that will come up.
All right, and we will wrap our Q&A section up today with one last question for Mac. In regards to the new HIPAA security and auditing analysis requirements, upon review of NitroView logs, does this Nitro integrated database address all security requirements under HIPAA?
Well, as it relates to what we were talking about today under database monitoring, the narrow answer is yes, as it relates to monitoring activity within a database or access to information in those databases. The database monitors only one segment of the infrastructure or the enterprise that needs to be monitored for HIPAA requirements. So obviously it takes more tools or more modules to actually accomplish all of monitoring requirements or auditing requirements that would be necessary. So you have other modules within the Nitro family that fall under the SIM that do things like log management, if you will, in terms of collecting access to servers and to other information, file shares, etc. There's IDS components that look at activity in the environment. There is a tie-in to other products such as Fair Warning that collect privacy alert audits events from healthcare applications themselves. And the nice thing is that the Nitro SIM actually takes all of these various feeds from all these various log sources, if you will, and integrates them together to give you one central correlated picture of what's going on in the environment. And assuming that you have all of the various components that are necessary to monitor access to all of the various places throughout the enterprise where you have protected health information, and the answer would be yes in the broader context, but in this particular context, we're just looking at the database access.
All right, thank you, Mac. Again, I would like to thank our speakers today for their presentation on behalf of HIMSS and NitroSecurity. I would also like to thank all of our attendees today for coming up with great questions and being a fabulous audience. An archive presentation of the recording along with the slides will be made available to you, so keep an eye on your emails over the next few days. And this concludes our presentation. Thank you, everyone.